You're too old. 3 words. Spoken loud enough for the whole platform to hear. Margaret Hale stood frozen as the man who'd promised her a future, the man whose letters had been her lifeline for 6 months, looked her up and down like spoiled goods and walked away. 52 years old, and she'd traveled 800 miles to be humiliated in front of strangers who laughed like it was theater. But this isn't a story about a woman who stayed broken. This is about what happened when she refused to disappear. Stay with me until the end. Like and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The train's whistle cut through the late afternoon air like a knife, sharp and final. Margaret Hale felt it in her chest, that sound of endings and beginnings tangled together in a way that made her stomach clench. She sat near the window in the last car, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the landscape change from rolling green hills to something harder, drier, more unforgiving. The frontier. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times during the long journey west. She'd pictured stepping off the train into sunlight, seeing him there, Edwin Moore, the rancher whose letters had been so carefully written, so full of quiet kindness. He'd written about his land, about the house he'd built with his own hands, about wanting someone to share the silence with. He'd never once mentioned needing youth or beauty. He'd talked about companionship, about partnership, about building something that would last. Margaret had believed every word. Now, as the train slowed and the rough buildings of the town came into view, her throat felt tight. She touched the cameo at her neck, her mother's, the only valuable thing she owned, and took a breath that didn't quite fill her lungs. The conductor passed through the car, calling out the stop. Redemption! Last stop! Redemption! The name had seemed hopeful in the letters. Now it just felt heavy. Margaret stood, smoothing her traveling dress with trembling fingers. The fabric was good quality, but years old, carefully mended in places only she could see. Her reflection in the window showed a woman with gray threading through dark hair she'd pinned up that morning with extra care. Fine lines marked the corners of her eyes and mouth, evidence of 52 years of living, of smiling, of grief, of surviving. She looked like what she was. A middle-aged woman who'd buried a husband, raised a daughter who'd moved east with her own family, and finally answered an advertisement that had promised a second chance. The train lurched to a stop. Margaret gathered her worn travel bag. Everything she owned fit inside it now, and made her way to the door. The conductor helped her down the steps, and suddenly she was standing on the platform, breathing air that smelled like dust and coal smoke, and something wild she couldn't name. The platform was busy. Men in work clothes hauled crates and barrels. A family with 3 small children struggled with an impossible pile of luggage. 2 older women in severe dark dresses stood near the station house, watching everything with the kind of sharp attention that missed nothing. Margaret scanned the crowd, looking for him. Edwin had sent a photograph, a formal portrait showing a stern-faced man with a thick mustache and eyes that seemed kind despite the rigid pose. He'd be 47 now, he'd written. A man who knew his own mind and his own limitations. Miss Hale? She turned toward the voice. He was taller than she'd expected, broader in the shoulders. The mustache was the same, but in person, his face seemed harder, his eyes colder. Edwin Moore stood 3 feet away, hat in hand, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Mr. Moore. Margaret smiled, feeling her heart hammer. I'm so pleased to finally... How old are you? The question cut her off mid-sentence. The smile froze on her face. I'm 52. I mentioned that in my first letter, I believe. 52. He said it like a diagnosis. His eyes traveled over her face, her hair, her dress, with a cold assessment that made her skin crawl. You look every year of it. The platform seemed to tilt. Margaret felt blood rush to her face. Around them, conversations were stopping. People were noticing. The 2 women near the station house had gone perfectly still, watching. Mr. Moore, your letters, you never indicated that age was a... I expected someone who could work, someone who could bear more children if needed, someone who wouldn't be a burden. His voice was loud enough now that it carried, deliberately loud. I don't need a grandmother, Miss Hale. I need a wife. I am perfectly capable. Look at you. He gestured at her with his hat, a dismissive wave that felt like a slap. Gray hair, Probably can't handle a full day's work anymore. I was expecting someone, younger, hardier, someone who hasn't already lived most of her life. Margaret's hands tightened on her bag. Her face burned. She was aware of every eye on the platform turning toward them, aware of the whispers starting, aware of a snicker from somewhere behind her. Your letters, she said quietly, fighting to keep her voice steady, gave me reason to believe that you valued character and companionship over... I valued honesty. His voice was sharp now, accusatory. You wrote like a woman in her 30s. You didn't mention the gray hair or the lines on your face. If I'd known, I told you my age. Her voice was firmer now, anger beginning to burn through the humiliation. In my very first letter, you responded with kindness. You said, I said a lot of things. Edwin Moore put his hat back on his head. But I'm not a charity house, Miss Hale. I work a ranch that needs strong hands and a strong back. I need someone who can pull their weight, not someone I'll be caring for in a few years when the work becomes too much. Laughter. Actual laughter. From the cluster of men near the freight car. One of them called out, Should have sent a recent picture, lady. Another voice. False advertising. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. She'd crossed 800 miles. She'd sold everything she couldn't carry. She'd left behind the small room in her daughter's house where she'd felt like a burden, where every day reminded her she was a widow with nowhere else to go. She'd believed Edwin Moore's careful words about partnership and building something together. She'd believed she still had value. Please. The word escaped before she could stop it, and she hated how small it sounded. I've come all this way. I have nowhere else to... That's not my problem. Edwin's face was cold now, final. I suggest you get back on the next train east, Miss Hale. There's nothing for you here. He turned to walk away. Mr. Moore, her voice cracked. Please, just... He didn't even look back. Margaret stood frozen on the platform, her bag clutched in white-knuckled hands, watching him stride away toward a wagon hitched near the edge of the station. The whispers around her grew louder. The two older women were talking behind their hands, their eyes sharp with judgment. The men by the freight car were grinning, nudging each other. Should have seen that coming, one of them said, not bothering to lower his voice. Old enough to be his mother. Desperate, I'd say, coming all this way for a man she's never met. Well, she's learned her lesson now, hasn't she? The family with the children had gone quiet, the mother herding her kids away as if rejection might be contagious. The conductor who'd helped Margaret off the train wouldn't meet her eyes. Margaret wanted to disappear. She wanted the platform to open up and swallow her whole. Instead, she stood there, a 52-year-old woman in a worn traveling dress, publicly rejected and publicly humiliated, with every eye in redemption marking her as unwanted. Edwin Moore's wagon rolled away, dust rising behind it. The next train east wouldn't arrive for 3 days. Margaret made her way to the station house on legs that felt disconnected from her body. The station master, a thin man with spectacles and an uncomfortable expression, glanced at her bag and then away quickly. Is there a hotel? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Or a boarding house? McAllister's, up Main Street. Can't miss it. He pointed vaguely, still not meeting her eyes. $3 a week, meals extra. $3. Margaret had $12.30 to her name, enough for 4 weeks if she didn't eat much. And then what? Thank you. She stepped off the platform into the street, and redemption opened up before her like a judgment. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with false front buildings that had clearly been built quickly and maintained grudgingly. A general store, a saloon, a barber shop, a blacksmith. Everything raw and new and temporary looking, as if the whole town might blow away in a strong wind. People stared. A woman sweeping the porch of the general store stopped mid-stroke to watch Margaret pass. 2 men in front of the saloon fell silent, their eyes following her. A young girl in a calico dress whispered something to her mother, who shushed her sharply but kept staring. Everyone had heard. Of course they had. This was a frontier town. Gossip probably traveled faster than the telegraph. Too old, too old, too old. The words beat in Margaret's head with every step. McAllister's boarding house was a 2-story structure that might have been painted white once but had faded to the color of old bones. The sign above the door hung slightly crooked. Margaret climbed the steps, knocked, and waited. The woman who answered was perhaps 60, with iron gray hair pulled back severely and a face that suggested she'd long ago stopped being surprised by anything. She looked Margaret up and down with the same assessing gaze Edwin Moore had used, but this time there was something different in it. Not quite sympathy, but recognition. "You're the one just came in on the train." It wasn't a question. "Yes, I need a room. The station master said $3 a week?" $3.50, includes breakfast and supper." The woman's voice was flat. "Payment in advance." Margaret's fingers fumbled with her purse. She counted out the bills carefully, watching a week and a half of survival disappear into the landlady's weathered hand. "Name's Josephine McAllister. Breakfast is at 7, supper at 6. No visitors in rooms, no noise after 9. Wash water's out back." She stepped aside to let Margaret enter. "You staying long?" The question hung in the dusty air of the narrow hallway. "I don't know yet." Josephine's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Maybe pity, maybe just the tiredness of someone who'd seen too many desperate women pass through. "Room's upstairs, second door on the right. Sheets are clean." The room was small, a narrow bed, a washstand, a chair, and a window that looked out onto the alley behind the building. Margaret set her bag down carefully and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. The silence pressed against her ears. She didn't cry. She'd cried herself empty in the year after Thomas died, and then again when her daughter Catherine had made it clear that while Mother was welcome, she was also in the way. An obligation, a burden, a reminder of grief that Catherine wanted to move past. So Margaret had answered the advertisement. Rancher seeking companionable woman for partnership in marriage. Age less important than character and willingness to work. Contact Edwin Moore, Redemption, Dakota Territory. She'd believed it. She'd believed that somewhere there might be a place for a woman who was no longer young, but still had hands that could work and a heart that could hope. She'd been a fool. Outside her window, the sun was setting, turning the sky the color of a bruise. Margaret stood and moved to look out. From here, she could see past the buildings to the land beyond. Rolling prairie that seemed to go on forever, grass moving in waves under the wind. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, beautiful and utterly indifferent to the small struggles of small people in a small town. A knock on the door made her turn. Josephine stood in the hallway holding a plate with bread, cheese, and dried apples. "You missed supper. Thought you might be hungry." Margaret stared at the unexpected kindness. "I can pay." "Didn't ask you to." Josephine set the plate on the washstand. "Eat. You look like you could use it." "Why?" The question escaped before Margaret could stop it. "Everyone else in this town has already decided I'm not worth their time. Why would you?" "Because I know what it's like to be judged before you've even opened your mouth." Josephine's voice was rough. "Because 30 years ago, I came here as a mail-order bride too. And the man who sent for me took one look at the scar on my face from a childhood burn and said I'd do for keeping house, but he wouldn't touch me as a wife." She paused at the door. "Eat. Tomorrow will be hard enough." The door closed softly. Margaret sat back down on the bed, looking at the plate of food. The bread was fresh, the cheese was good quality, the apples had been sliced carefully. She ate slowly, tasting each bite, trying not to think about tomorrow or the day after, or how she would survive in a place that had already marked her as unwanted. When she finished, she lay down fully clothed on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, a piano played badly in what was probably the saloon. Men's voices rose in laughter. The town of Redemption went about its evening, utterly unconcerned with Margaret Hale and her ruined hopes. She woke to gray light filtering through the thin curtains. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then, it all came rushing back. The platform, the rejection, the stairs. Margaret sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping in her clothes. A pitcher of wash water stood on the stand. Josephine must have brought it while Margaret slept. She washed her face and hands, changed into her other dress, only slightly less worn than the first, and tried to pin her hair in a way that felt dignified. The mirror above the washstand showed her the truth. She looked exactly like what Edwin Moore had called her. Too old. Too used up. Too late for second chances. Margaret turned away from her reflection. Breakfast in the boarding house dining room was a silent affair. Three other residents sat at the long table, two men who worked at the rail yard and a younger woman who didn't meet anyone's eyes. They ate quickly and left. Josephine served coffee and biscuits without comment. "Is there work in town?" Margaret asked quietly. "For a woman?" Josephine refilled her coffee. "Laundry sometimes. Sewing if you're good at it. The hotel takes on help when they're busy, but they're not." She paused. "What can you do?" "I can cook, clean, sew. I kept house for my husband for 23 years. After he died, I helped my daughter with her children. I'm strong enough, despite what—" She stopped, not wanting to say his name. "Despite what that fool said yesterday." Josephine's voice was flat. "Edwin Moore's got a mean streak. His first wife left him after 2 years, went back east and never looked back. Should have been your first warning." "He didn't mention a first wife in his letters." "No, he wouldn't." Josephine sat down across from Margaret, her coffee cup cradled in weathered hands. "Look, I'll be straight with you. This town doesn't have much charity in it, especially not for women who arrive without a man. You might find work, but it'll be hard, and it won't pay much. Most women in your position get back on the next train." "I don't have anywhere to go back to." The words hung in the air between them. Josephine studied her for a long moment. "Then you'd better be tough." Margaret spent the morning walking the streets of Redemption, looking for work. The general store didn't need help. The hotel's owner took one look at her and said they only hired girls under 30. The seamstress had enough work for herself and didn't need assistance. The restaurant owner asked her age and then said he was looking for someone younger. By noon, Margaret's feet hurt and her pride was in tatters. She sat on a bench outside the general store, watching the town move around her. Wagons rolled past, kicking up dust. A group of ranch hands rode by, their horses' hooves loud on the packed earth. Women in their Sunday clothes walked arm in arm, their voices carrying snippets of gossip. That woman from yesterday. Can you imagine, traveling all this way? Should have known better at her age. Margaret closed her eyes. "You look like you could use this." She opened her eyes to find a young woman standing in front of her, holding out a tin cup of water. The woman was perhaps 25, with auburn hair and a kind face dusted with freckles. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a basket over one arm. "Thank you." Margaret took the cup gratefully. The water was cold and clean. "I'm Alice Warren. I work at the general store." The young woman sat down on the bench beside her. "I saw you this morning asking about work." "Margaret Hale." She drank the water slowly. "I don't suppose you know of any opportunities your employer might have mentioned?" "No, I'm sorry. Mr. Peterson's tight with money, even in good times." Alice hesitated. "I heard what happened yesterday at the station." Margaret's hands tightened on the cup. "I imagine everyone heard." "Small town. People talk." Alice's voice was gentle. "For what it's worth, Edwin Moore's a bastard. Excuse my language, but it's true. You're better off without him." "Perhaps, but that doesn't solve my immediate problem." Margaret handed back the cup. "Thank you for the kindness." "It's more than most have shown." Alice stood, then paused. "There's a man who lives out past the town boundary. Samuel Carter. He comes in once a month for supplies, keeps to himself mostly. I heard him mention he could use help with his property, someone to cook and clean. It's not much, but—" She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "But it's something. He's a decent man from what I can tell. Quiet, never caused trouble." Alice shifted her basket. "He'll be in town tomorrow morning if you want to ask. He usually comes to the store around 8. "Thank you, Alice. Truly." The young woman smiled. "We women have to look out for each other, don't we? Especially in a place like this." She walked away, leaving Margaret sitting on the bench with the first small spark of hope she'd felt since arriving. That night, lying in her narrow bed at McAllister's, Margaret counted her remaining money by lamplight. $8.80. Enough for 2 more weeks if she was careful, less if she needed anything beyond basic room and board. She thought about Samuel Carter, the quiet man who might need help. It wasn't what she'd imagined when she'd answered Edwin Moore's letter. It wasn't partnership or marriage or building something together. But it was work. It was survival. And maybe, in a town called Redemption, that would have to be enough. Outside her window, the prairie wind picked up, rattling the glass. Margaret blew out the lamp and closed her eyes, trying not to think about the platform, about the stairs, about Edwin Moore's cold voice saying she was too old to matter. Tomorrow, she would ask a stranger for work. Tomorrow, she would try again. Because what other choice did she have? The wind howled like something wild and lonely, and Margaret fell asleep to the sound of it, dreaming of trains that only traveled backward and doors that opened onto nothing but empty sky. Morning came too quickly. Margaret woke with her heart already racing, the pale light through her window feeling less like dawn and more like a countdown. She dressed carefully in her better dress, the one she'd saved for meeting Edwin Moore as his wife, and tried to smooth the wrinkles that came from being folded in a travel bag for weeks. Her hands shook as she pinned her hair, and she had to start over twice before the pins held steady. In the dining room, Josephine poured coffee without comment, but her eyes followed Margaret with something that might have been concern. The other boarders had already left for their work, leaving Margaret alone with her breakfast and her nerves. "The man Alice mentioned," Margaret said quietly, cupping her hands around the warm mug. "Samuel Carter. Do you know him?" Josephine was silent for a moment, wiping down the already clean table. "Keeps to himself. Lost his wife and boy to fever about 5 years back. Built a cabin out past the northern boundary, barely comes to town except for supplies." She paused. "He's not dangerous if that's what you're asking. Just broken, I suppose. Like most of us." Alice said he might need help. "Might? He's never asked for it before." Josephine met her eyes. "But then you're not exactly in a position to be particular, are you?" The words weren't cruel, just honest. Margaret nodded and finished her coffee in silence. At 7:45, she walked to the general store. The morning was clear and cool. The sky stretched wide and endless overhead. Already people were out. The blacksmith's hammer rang against his anvil. Women gathered near the water pump with their buckets. A freight wagon rolled past loaded with lumber. Margaret felt their eyes on her again, felt the weight of yesterday's humiliation following her like a shadow. The general store's door stood open, and Alice was inside arranging bolts of fabric on the shelves. She brightened when she saw Margaret. "You came. I wasn't sure you would." "I don't have the luxury of pride anymore," Margaret said, and was surprised to find she could say it without bitterness. It was simply true. "He should be here soon. He's punctual as a church bell. First Tuesday of every month, 8 o'clock sharp." Alice glanced toward the door. "Just don't expect much conversation. He's not what you'd call talkative." They didn't have to wait long. At precisely 8 o'clock, a man appeared in the doorway, and Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Not attraction exactly, but recognition. Here was someone else who carried weight. Samuel Carter was perhaps 45, tall and lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate sparingly. His clothes were clean but worn, patched in places with careful stitches. Dark hair threaded with gray fell past his collar, and his face was weathered by sun and wind into deep lines around his eyes and mouth. But it was his eyes that caught her, gray as storm clouds, holding a kind of tired watchfulness that suggested he expected nothing good from the world and had stopped being surprised when that expectation was met. He nodded to Alice, his gaze passing over Margaret without interest, and moved to the counter with a list already in his hand. "Morning, Mr. Carter?" Alice said brightly. "The usual?" "Yes, ma'am." His voice was rough, like it didn't get used often. "And if you have lamp oil, I'll take 2 bottles." "We do." Alice glanced at Margaret, then back at Samuel. "Mr. Carter, this is Margaret Hale. She's new to town and looking for work. I thought, well, I remembered you mentioning you could use help with your place." For the first time, Samuel looked directly at Margaret. His eyes moved over her face without expression, taking in the gray hair, the lines, the worn dress. She forced herself to stand straight, to meet his gaze without flinching. "I can cook and clean," Margaret said when the silence stretched too long. "I'm a hard worker, Mr. Carter. I don't need much, just fair wages and a chance to earn my keep." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise maybe at her directness. "I live alone, out past town about 5 miles. It's not suitable for a lady." "I'm not looking for suitable. I'm looking for work." Alice busied herself with gathering items from Samuel's list, but Margaret could see her listening intently. Samuel studied Margaret for another long moment. "Can you cook over a wood fire? The cabin doesn't have a proper stove." "Yes." "The work would be hard. Cleaning, cooking, washing, mending. The place has been neglected. I understand. I can pay 50 cents a week. Meals included while you're working. 50 cents. It was barely anything, but it was more than the nothing she had now. That's acceptable. He nodded slowly, as if making up his mind about something. I come to town once a month. You could ride out with me today, see the place. If it doesn't suit you, I'll bring you back tomorrow with no hard feelings. Margaret felt Alice's hopeful gaze on her. She thought about the $8.80 in her purse, about the boarding house room she could afford for 2 more weeks, about the stares and whispers that followed her through Redemption's streets. When do we leave? Hour. I need to finish my business here first. I'll be ready. Samuel turned back to Alice to complete his order, and Margaret slipped outside before her legs could start shaking. She walked quickly back to McAllister's, climbed the stairs to her room, and packed her bag with trembling hands. Everything she owned fit inside. 2 dresses, undergarments, her mother's cameo, a hairbrush, a small sewing kit, and the letters from Edwin Moore that she should have burned, but hadn't. Josephine was in the hallway when Margaret came down. You're leaving. I found work. A man named Samuel Carter needs help with his property. Josephine's expression didn't change, but her voice dropped. Be careful out there. It's isolated. If something goes wrong, something's already gone wrong, Margaret said quietly. This is me, trying to make it right. For a moment, the 2 women looked at each other, both of them mail-order brides, who'd learned the hard way that promises written in letters often dissolved like smoke when held up to daylight. You paid through the week, Josephine said finally. If it doesn't work out, your room will be here. Thank you. Margaret walked back to the general store, her bag heavy in her hand. Samuel was loading supplies into a weathered wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. He glanced at her bag but didn't comment, just nodded toward the wagon seat. Climb up? She did, settling herself on the hard bench. Samuel finished securing the supplies, checked the horses' harnesses with careful attention, then climbed up beside her. The seat was narrow enough that their shoulders nearly touched. It's a rough ride, he said, picking up the reins. Hold on to the rail. The wagon lurched forward, and Redemption began to fall away behind them. They rode in silence. The road, barely more than twin ruts worn into the prairie, stretched north across land that seemed to have no end. Grass rolled in waves under the wind, dotted here and there with scrub brush and the occasional twisted tree. The sky was enormous, pressing down with a weight that made Margaret feel both exposed and invisible at the same time. Samuel drove with quiet competence, his eyes scanning the horizon constantly. Margaret studied him from the corner of her eye, the set of his shoulders, the careful way he held the reins, the deep lines around his mouth that spoke of someone who'd forgotten how to smile. After nearly an hour of silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the sound of hooves, Margaret finally spoke. Alice said you lost your family. I'm sorry. His jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't respond. 5 years ago, fever took them both within 3 days. His voice was flat, reciting facts. My wife, Sarah, and my boy, Thomas. He was 7. The pain in those simple words was like a physical thing. Margaret knew that pain. She'd carried it herself when her husband died, when she'd had to wash his body for burial and explain to a 12-year-old Catherine that Papa wasn't coming back. My husband died 6 years ago, she said quietly. Heart gave out while he was working in the field. Our daughter found him. Samuel glanced at her, and for the first time she saw something other than wariness in his eyes. Understanding, maybe. The recognition of shared grief. It doesn't get easier, he said. No, you just get better at carrying it. They fell back into silence, but it felt different now. Less like strangers avoiding conversation, and more like 2 people who understood that some things didn't need words. The land began to change. The flat prairie gave way to gentle rolls, and trees appeared more frequently, cottonwoods and aspens that marked the presence of water. Samuel guided the wagon down into a shallow valley where a creek ran clear over smooth stones. We're close, he said. The cabin appeared through the trees like something that had grown there rather than been built. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney, a roof that sagged slightly on one side. It sat in a clearing near the creek, surrounded by tall grass that had gone wild. A small barn stood behind it, and Margaret could see a chicken coop that leaned precariously to one side. Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop and sat for a moment, his hands still on the reins, looking at the cabin as if seeing it through her eyes. "It's not much," he said finally. Margaret climbed down before he could help her, her boots sinking into the overgrown grass. The cabin looked tired, neglected, like it had given up trying to be a home. But it had good bones. The logs were solid, the chimney intact. The windows were shuttered, but whole. "It's honest," she said. "That's more than some things I've encountered lately." The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. He unhitched the horses and led them to the barn while Margaret approached the cabin door. It stood slightly ajar and she pushed it open slowly. The hinges creaked. Inside, the single room was dim and dusty. A bed frame stood against one wall, the mattress rolled up and covered with a canvas tarp. A rough table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the space. Shelves lined one wall, mostly empty except for a few tin plates and cups. The fireplace dominated the far wall, cold and dark, the stones blackened with old smoke. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust that spoke of months, maybe years, of minimal living. This wasn't a home. It was a shelter someone used to keep the rain off while they waited to die. Margaret set down her bag and walked to the shuttered window. She pulled it open, and light flooded in along with fresh air that smelled of grass and water. Dust motes swirled in the sudden brightness. Samuel appeared in the doorway, watching her. "The well is out back," he said. "Water's clean. There's a root cellar for storage. It stays cool even in summer. The barn has tools if you need them." "Where do you sleep?" "The barn has been since—" He didn't finish. "Since his family died. Since this place stopped being a home and became a reminder of everything he'd lost." Margaret turned to face him fully. "Mr. Carter, I'll be honest with you. I came to this territory as a mail-order bride and was rejected on the train platform in front of half the town. I have less than $9 to my name and nowhere else to go. I need this work, and I'll do it well. But I also need to know, what exactly are you expecting from this arrangement?" He met her directness with his own. "I need someone to make this place livable again. Cook meals I don't have to think about, keep things clean, maybe tend the chickens and the garden plot that's gone to weeds. I work from dawn until dark trying to build up enough stock to make a living. I don't have time to keep house." He paused. "I'm expecting work, Mrs. Hale. Nothing else. You'll sleep here. I'll sleep in the barn. 50 cents a week, meals included, and I'll bring you to town if you want to leave." The clarity was almost startling. No hidden expectations, no implications, just work. "Then we have an understanding. There's stew from yesterday in the pot by the fire. Might still be good if you heat it up. I need to see to the horses and check the fence line before dark." He hesitated. "If this isn't what you expected—" "Mr. Carter," Margaret interrupted gently, "I stopped expecting anything the moment Edwin Moore walked away from me on that platform. This is more than I hoped for yesterday. It's enough." He nodded once and left, his boots heavy on the porch steps. Margaret stood alone in the dusty cabin and felt something she hadn't felt in days. Purpose. She rolled up her sleeves. The rest of that day passed in a blur of work. Margaret found a broom with half its bristles missing and swept 5 years of dust and debris out the door. She located buckets in the barn and hauled water from the well, heating it over a fire she built in the hearth. She scrubbed the table and chairs, the shelves, the floor. She beat the dust from the mattress and discovered it was actually in decent condition, just neglected. In the root cellar, she found potatoes, onions, dried beans, and a slab of salt pork. The stew Samuel had mentioned was indeed still edible, barely, but Margaret dumped it out and started fresh. By the time the sun was setting, she had a proper meal cooking over the fire, beans with salt pork, pan bread, and the last of some wrinkled apples sliced and fried in a little lard. Samuel came in as darkness fell, pausing in the doorway as if entering a place he didn't quite recognize. The cabin was transformed. The floors gleamed in the firelight. The windows sparkled. The air smelled of soap and cooking food instead of abandonment. "I found plates and cups," Margaret said, stirring the beans. "They were buried in the back of the shelf, needed washing, but they're sound." He stood very still, his eyes moving around the room. You've been busy. I told you I could work. She ladled stew into 2 bowls and set them on the now clean table. Sit, eat while it's hot. For a moment, she thought he might refuse. Then he lowered himself into one of the chairs, carefully, as if it might break or disappear. Margaret sat across from him and bowed her head briefly before picking up her spoon. Samuel ate in silence, but she noticed he finished everything in his bowl and took a second piece of bread. When he was done, he sat back and looked at her directly. Thank you. For cooking? That's what you're paying me for. For this, he gestured around the cabin. It hasn't looked like this since Sarah died. I'd forgotten it could. The raw honesty in his voice caught Margaret off guard. She set down her spoon carefully. Sometimes we forget what things can be when we've spent too long living with what they are. He studied her across the table, and she felt the weight of his attention, not judgment, but genuine curiosity. That man who rejected you, Edwin Moore, he's a fool. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. He wanted someone younger, someone who could give him more years. He wanted someone he could control. Samuel's voice was hard. I know his type. His first wife left him because he had a mean temper and a heavy hand. Town doesn't talk about it much, but everyone knows. You're better off here. Here in your barn, you mean? Sleeping in a cabin while you exile yourself to the hay? I'm not exiled. I choose it. Do you? Or have you just been punishing yourself for surviving when they didn't? The words came out sharper than she intended. Samuel's face went rigid, his jaw clenched. For a moment, she thought she'd gone too far, that he would tell her to pack her bag and leave. Instead, he stood slowly and carried his bowl to the wash basin. I'll be in the barn. Bar the door after I leave. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Hale. He turned to face her, and his eyes were full of something dark and painful. I appreciate your work today. I appreciate your directness. But there are some things that aren't your business to comment on. We have an arrangement, work for wages. Let's keep it at that. He walked out, and Margaret heard his boots on the porch, then silence. She sat alone at the table, the fire crackling in the hearth, and felt the weight of her own exhaustion settle over her. Too far. She'd pushed too far, too fast. Here was a man offering her work and safety, and expecting nothing in return, and she'd repaid him by prodding at his wounds. Margaret cleaned up the supper dishes, banked the fire, and prepared for bed. The cabin felt strange, too quiet, too empty, too full of ghosts she couldn't see. She thought about Samuel in the barn, sleeping in hay because this place held too many memories. She thought about Edwin Moore and his cruel rejection. She thought about her daughter Catherine, so eager to start her own life that she gently but firmly suggested Mother might be happier somewhere else. She thought about all the ways the world told women like her that they were finished, used up, no longer valuable. And then she stopped thinking and let sleep take her. Something woke her in the deepest part of the night. Margaret lay still, listening. Rain. It drummed on the roof in steady rhythm, and wind rattled the shutters. A storm had rolled in while she slept. She thought about Samuel in the barn, about whether the roof there was sound or if rain was leaking through. It wasn't her concern. He'd made that clear. They had an arrangement, and she should keep to her side of it. But the image of him lying in wet hay, too stubborn to come inside, nagged at her conscience. Margaret rose, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and went to the door. She lifted the bar and stepped onto the porch. Rain sheeted down, silver in the darkness. The barn was a darker shape against the dark sky. She was halfway across the muddy yard before she could talk herself out of it. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside it was dry but drafty, and she could hear the horses moving restlessly in their stalls. A lantern burned low on a post, and in its dim light she saw Samuel sitting on a pile of hay, his back against the wall, wide awake. The roof leaks in the back corner, he said without looking at her, but it's dry here. Margaret stepped inside, water dripping from her shawl. I came to apologize. What I said earlier about punishing yourself, it wasn't my place. No, it wasn't. He finally looked at her. But it also wasn't wrong. The admission hung between them. I sleep out here because in there, I can still hear Thomas laughing, Samuel said quietly. I can still smell Sarah's bread baking. I can still feel them everywhere, and it hurts too much. Out here, it's just hay and horses and rain. It's easier. Margaret sat down on an overturned crate, her wet shawl clutched around her shoulders. My husband died in the field behind our house. For 2 years, I couldn't look out the kitchen window without seeing him fall. I used to take the long way around the house just to avoid that view. She paused. But then one day, I realized I'd forgotten the exact color of his eyes, and that scared me more than the memory of losing him. What did you do? I forced myself to look out that window every morning. I made myself remember, not just his death, but his life. The way he sang badly while he worked, how he always saved the last bite of supper for me, the sound of his laugh. Her voice roughened. The memories hurt, but forgetting hurt worse. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching rain drip through the gap in the barn roof. Thomas wanted to be a blacksmith. He used to hang around the forge in town, watching the smith work. He'd come home covered in soot, grinning like he'd found treasure. He sounds wonderful. He was. Samuel's voice cracked slightly. Sarah used to say he had my stubbornness and her joy, best of both of us. You were lucky to have them, even for the time you did. I know. Doesn't make it easier. No, Margaret agreed. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe we're not supposed to make it easier. Maybe we're just supposed to keep going anyway. They sat in the barn as rain hammered the roof and wind howled through the cracks. Two people who'd lost everything that mattered, finding themselves thrown together by circumstance and desperation. Finally, Samuel stood. You should get back inside. You'll catch cold out here. Margaret rose, pulling her wet shawl tighter. Will you consider sleeping in the cabin? There's room. I can make a pallet by the fire for myself. Mrs. Hale. Or you can freeze out here out of stubbornness. Your choice, Mr. Carter. The ghost of a smile crossed his face. You don't pull your punches, do you? I'm 52 years old and was publicly rejected 3 days ago. I don't have the energy for dancing around the truth anymore. He considered this, then nodded slowly. I'll think about it. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't refusal either. Margaret took it as a small victory and headed back through the rain to the cabin. She changed into dry clothes and rebuilt the fire, then lay back down on the bed. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, the cabin felt a little less empty than it had before. She didn't hear Samuel come in, but when she woke to gray dawn light, there was a blanket rolled up by the fireplace and his boots drying near the hearth. He'd come inside. He'd taken that first small step back toward the land of the living. Margaret rose and started breakfast, and when Samuel emerged from the barn, apparently he'd gone back out at first light to tend the animals, she had coffee brewing and eggs frying in the pan. They ate together without speaking much, but the silence was comfortable now. After breakfast, Samuel headed out to work on the fence line, and Margaret attacked the chicken coop with determination. By midday, she had it cleaned, repaired, and producing eggs again. The days began to develop a rhythm. Samuel worked the land, mending fences, tending his small herd of cattle, clearing brush. Margaret transformed the cabin and its surroundings, washing, mending, cooking, gardening. They spoke little, but what they did say carried weight. In the evenings, they ate together at the clean table. Sometimes Samuel would mention a repair that needed doing, and Margaret would offer to help. Sometimes she would ask about the land, and he would tell her about the creek's flow or where the best grazing was. Small exchanges that began to build something neither of them had names for yet. On the fourth night, as Margaret was cleaning up after supper, Samuel spoke from his seat by the fire. I'll sleep inside tonight, if that's still acceptable. Margaret didn't turn around, didn't make it into something bigger than it was. I'll make up the pallet. No need, I can use the bed. You take it. Mr. Carter. Samuel, he interrupted. If we're living under the same roof, you might as well use my Christian name, and I'll call you Margaret if that's all right. She turned to face him. That's all right. That night, Margaret made her pallet by the fire while Samuel took the bed. She lay awake for a while, listening to him breathe in the darkness, hearing the small sounds of someone trying to get comfortable in a space full of memories. Eventually, his breathing evened out into sleep. Margaret closed her eyes and felt something unexpected, peace. A week passed, then 2. Margaret's hands grew rough from work, her back ached from hauling water and scrubbing floors, but she felt more alive than she had in years. There was satisfaction in watching the cabin transform, in seeing Samuel eat meals he actually enjoyed, in collecting eggs from chickens that had been half wild when she arrived. They developed an easy partnership. Samuel taught her to patch the roof when it leaked. She taught him how to make bread that didn't taste like sawdust. They worked side by side in the garden plot, coaxing vegetables from the reluctant soil. And slowly, carefully, they began to share pieces of their lives. Samuel told her about building the cabin with his own hands, about Sarah's laugh, about Thomas's fascination with everything mechanical. Margaret spoke of her marriage, of raising Catherine, of the quiet joy of ordinary days before loss came calling. It wasn't until the third week that the peaceful rhythm broke. Margaret had walked to the creek to wash clothes, enjoying the warm afternoon and the sound of water over stones. She was wringing out one of Samuel's shirts when she heard horses approaching, multiple horses, moving fast. She looked up to see 3 riders entering the clearing near the cabin. Even from a distance, she recognized the man in the lead, Edwin Moore. Her hands froze on the wet fabric. For a moment, she considered staying hidden, pretending she wasn't there. Then she thought about the woman who'd stepped off that train 3 weeks ago, desperate, humiliated, willing to accept crumbs. That woman was gone. Margaret gathered the wet laundry, put it in the basket, and walked steadily toward the cabin. Edwin and his companions had dismounted and were looking around with expressions that made her skin crawl, assessing, judging, finding everything wanting. "Well," Edwin said when he saw her approaching, "so this is where you ended up, living in sin with the hermit." Margaret set down the laundry basket and faced him squarely. "Mr. Moore, I wasn't expecting visitors. What brings you all the way out here?" His eyes traveled over her, the work dress stained with soil and water, the hair escaping from its pins, the sun-reddened face. "I came to see if the rumors were true. Margaret Hale, the woman too old to be a proper wife, shacking up with Samuel Carter like a common—" "Finish that sentence," came Samuel's voice from behind Edwin, "and we're going to have a problem." Margaret's heart jumped. Samuel stood 10 feet away, an axe hanging loosely in his hand from whatever work he'd been doing. His face was calm, but his eyes were hard as stones. Edwin turned, and something ugly flickered across his face. "Carter, didn't hear you come up." "Clearly." Samuel's gaze moved to the other 2 men, ranch hands by their look, younger and uncertain. "Mrs. Hale works for me. She keeps house in exchange for wages. That's all there is to it." "That's not what people are saying in town." "I don't care what people say in town, and neither should you, seeing as you gave up any right to comment on Mrs. Hale's situation when you humiliated her on that train platform." Edwin's face flushed. "Now, listen here." "No, you listen." Samuel stepped forward, and despite the axe in his hand, his voice stayed level. "You made your choice. You rejected a good woman in the cruelest way possible. She found honest work and a safe place. That bothers you? That's your problem. But you don't get to ride out here and sling accusations." One of the ranch hands shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Moore, maybe we should—" "Stay out of this, Davis." Edwin's attention snapped back to Margaret. "I came to offer you another chance. I was hasty before. Maybe we can work something out after all." The words were so absurd that for a moment Margaret couldn't process them. Then understanding dawned cold and clear. He didn't want her. He wanted to take away the thing that made him look like a fool, the woman he'd rejected finding value somewhere else. "No," she said simply. "You haven't even heard my offer." "I don't need to. My answer is no." Edwin's face darkened. "You'd rather be his hired woman than my wife? Rather live in this hovel than on a proper ranch?" "Yes." Margaret's voice was steady. "Because he treats me with respect, because he values my work, because he sees me as a person instead of a burden or a possession. So yes, Mr. Moore, I would rather be here." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Edwin's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment Margaret thought he might actually strike her. Then Samuel was there, moving between them with quiet purpose. "Time for you to leave," he said. "This isn't over." "Yes," Samuel said quietly, "it is. Don't come back here more. There's nothing for you." Edwin stared at him for a long moment, then at Margaret. Whatever he saw in her face made something shift in his expression. A realization, maybe, that the desperate woman from the train platform was truly gone. He turned and mounted his horse. "You'll regret this." "I doubt that," Margaret said. She watched the three riders disappear through the trees, watched until the sound of hooves faded completely. Only then did she allow herself to breathe fully. Samuel stood beside her, the axe still in his hand, his presence solid and reassuring. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For standing with me. For not making me face that alone." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Warmth, maybe, or the beginning of it. "You didn't need me," he said. "You handled that just fine on your own." "Maybe, but it was better not having to." They stood together in the clearing as afternoon light slanted through the trees and the creek murmured its endless song. Two people who'd been broken in different ways, learning slowly how to be whole again. That night, thunder rumbled in the distance, and by the time they finished supper, rain was falling again. Margaret cleaned the dishes while Samuel sat by the fire, unusually quiet. "He'll come back," Samuel said finally. "Men like Edwin Moore don't like being told no, especially not in front of witnesses." "I know." Margaret dried the last plate and put it away. "I'm not afraid of him." "Maybe you should be. He's got a temper and enough pride to be dangerous." She turned to face him. "Are you saying I should have accepted his offer, gone back to town with him?" "No." The word was sharp, immediate. Samuel stood and crossed to where she stood by the table. "I'm saying I won't let him hurt you. Whatever comes next, you're not facing it alone." The certainty in his voice made something catch in Margaret's chest. "Why? We barely know each other." "Don't we?" He held her gaze. "I know you're brave enough to start over in a place where no one wanted you. I know you work harder than anyone I've ever met. I know you speak truth even when it's uncomfortable. I know you made this cabin feel like a home again when I'd given up on it ever being more than a place to wait for death." He paused. "Maybe that's enough." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sharp, unexpected sweetness of being truly seen. "I thought I was too old for second chances." "So did I." Samuel's voice softened. "Turns out we were both wrong." The rain intensified, hammering the roof, and somewhere in the distance lightning split the sky. But inside the cabin, warmed by firelight and something neither of them was quite ready to name, Margaret felt safer than she had in years. She'd come west looking for a husband and found rejection. But here, in this isolated cabin with a grieving widower who slept with ghosts, she'd found something else entirely. She'd found herself again. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something worth more than any promise written in a stranger's letters. The storm that night was fierce, but it passed. What didn't pass was the tension that settled over the cabin like invisible fog in the days that followed. Samuel became watchful in a way that made Margaret's stomach clench, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line when he worked outside, his hand never far from the rifle he now kept propped by the door. "You're expecting him to come back," Margaret said on the third morning after Edwin's visit. She was kneading bread dough, her hands working the rhythm she'd learned from her own mother decades ago. Samuel stood at the window, coffee cup in hand, looking out at the clearing. "Men like Moore don't make threats they don't intend to keep. He'll come back. Question is when. Maybe he's had time to think better of it." Maybe, but his tone said he didn't believe it. Margaret shaped the dough into loaves and set them to rise near the fire. She wiped flour from her hands and crossed to stand beside him at the window. The morning was clear and bright, birds singing in the cottonwoods, the creek glittering in sunlight. It looked peaceful. It felt like the calm before something broke. "I won't go back to town," she said quietly, "if that's what you're worried about. I won't let him bully me into leaving." Samuel turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I'm not worried about you leaving. I'm worried about him hurting you to get at me." "Why would he want to get at you?" "Because I stood up to him in front of his men. Because you chose this place over his ranch. Because—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "Because it's clear to anyone paying attention that this isn't just an employer and employee anymore." The words hung between them, fragile and terrifying and true. Margaret felt heat rise in her face, but she didn't look away. "No," she said softly. It isn't. Samuel set down his coffee cup carefully, as if afraid sudden movement might shatter whatever was building between them. Margaret, I need you to understand something. When Sarah and Thomas died, I buried myself with them. I didn't just move to the barn, I moved out of life entirely. I worked until I couldn't think, slept when exhaustion forced it, existed without living for 5 years. His voice roughened. And then you showed up, this woman everyone said was too old to matter, and you walked into my half-dead life and made it come alive again. You made me remember what it feels like to sit across the table from someone and share a meal, what it feels like to laugh at something small, what it feels like to want to wake up in the morning. Margaret's throat tightened. Samuel, I'm not saying this right. What I mean is, if Moore comes here looking for trouble, he won't find you alone. He won't find you unprotected. Because somewhere in these last few weeks, you stopped being just my hired help and became something I can't afford to lose. Before Margaret could respond, before she could find words for the tangle of emotions in her chest, a sound made them both freeze. Horses. Multiple horses, approaching fast. Samuel grabbed the rifle and moved to the door in one fluid motion. Get back from the window. Margaret's heart hammered, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she reached for the heavy iron skillet hanging by the fireplace. If there was going to be trouble, she wouldn't face it unarmed. The riders burst into the clearing, 4 of them this time, not 3. Edwin Moore led them, but the other men weren't his ranch hands. These were harder men, rough-looking, the kind who made their living on the wrong side of the law. Margaret recognized the type from the frontier towns she'd passed through on her way west. Drifters, guns for hire, men who'd do anything for the right price. Stay inside, Samuel said, his voice hard. No matter what happens, stay inside and bar the door. I won't leave you to face them alone. Margaret, no. She gripped the skillet tighter. We face this together or not at all. For a moment their eyes met, and she saw fear in his. Not for himself, but for her. Then he nodded once, accepting her choice, and stepped out onto the porch. Margaret followed, staying slightly behind him, the skillet heavy in her hands. Edwin sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who'd brought overwhelming force and knew it. The 3 men with him spread out slightly, creating a semicircle that felt like a trap closing. Carter, Edwin said, his voice falsely pleasant. I brought some friends. Thought we might have a more productive conversation this time. We had our conversation. I told you not to come back. See, that's where you made a mistake. Edwin swung down from his saddle, and the other men did the same. You don't get to tell me where I can and can't go, and you certainly don't get to steal what's rightfully mine. I'm not yours, Margaret said, her voice cutting through the tension. I never was. Edwin's eyes fixed on her with something ugly in them. You came here to marry me. That was the deal. Just because you got cold feet doesn't mean you can break our agreement. There was no agreement. You rejected me, remember? In front of half the town. You called me too old, too worn out to be of use. I changed my mind. Well, I didn't. Margaret stepped forward, level with Samuel now. I told you no, Mr. Moore. That should have been the end of it. One of the hired men, a tall, rangy fellow with a scar across his jaw, laughed. She's got spirit, Moore. Maybe you should have appreciated that before you ran her off. Shut up, Briggs. Edwin's face was flushed now, anger breaking through his controlled facade. This doesn't concern you. You're paying us to be here, Briggs said with a shrug. That makes it concern us. Samuel's grip on the rifle tightened. Whatever you're planning, Edwin, it ends badly for everyone. Take your men and go. Or what? You'll shoot all 4 of us? Edwin smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You might get 1, maybe 2 before they take you down. And then what happens to your precious Margaret? The threat was clear, hanging in the air like poison. Margaret felt ice slide down her spine, but she forced herself to stand steady, to show no fear. Here's what's going to happen, Edwin continued, his voice taking on a lecturing tone. Margaret is going to gather her things and come back to town with me. We'll have a quiet wedding, and this whole embarrassing situation will be resolved. You, Carter, are going to stand aside and let it happen. Because if you don't, my friends here will make sure you're in no condition to object. And if I refuse? Margaret asked. Edwin's smile widened. Then we'll have to convince you. Briggs, show the lady we're serious. The scarred man stepped forward, reaching for Margaret's arm. She didn't think. She just reacted. The iron skillet swung in a wide arc and connected with Briggs's temple with a sound like a hammer hitting wood. He dropped like a felled tree, blood streaming from the gash she'd opened. For a moment, everyone froze in shock. Then chaos erupted. One of the other men lunged for Margaret, but Samuel was faster. The rifle butt caught him square in the stomach, doubling him over. Samuel brought the weapon around and leveled it at Edwin's chest. "Call them off, now!" But the third hired gun had already drawn his pistol. The shot cracked through the clearing, loud as thunder. Samuel spun, the rifle flying from his hands, blood blooming on his left shoulder. "Samuel!" Margaret's scream tore from her throat. He stumbled but didn't fall, his right hand going to the wound, his face white with shock and pain. The gunman aimed again, but Margaret was already moving. She threw the skillet with all her strength, and it struck his gun hand hard enough to send the pistol flying. "Get inside!" Samuel shouted at her, but she was done listening to reason. The man Samuel had gut-punched was recovering, reaching for his own weapon. Margaret grabbed a piece of firewood from the porch pile and swung it like a club, catching him across the back. He went down with a grunt. Edwin stood frozen, clearly not expecting this level of resistance. "Enough!" he shouted. "All of you, stop!" But it was too late for stopping. Briggs was groaning on the ground, blood pooling beneath his head. The gut-punched man was crawling toward his horse. The gunman cradled his injured hand, cursing viciously. Samuel had retrieved his rifle with his good arm and now pointed it steadily at Edwin's chest, despite the blood soaking his shirt. "You shot me," he said, his voice deadly calm. "On my own land, in front of a witness. That's attempted murder, more." Edwin's face had gone pale. "That wasn't... I didn't tell him to shoot. I just wanted to scare you." "Well, congratulations. You've scared me into making sure you never come back here." Samuel's finger moved to the trigger. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't end this right now." "Because that would make you a murderer," Margaret said quietly, moving to Samuel's side. Blood was dripping from his fingertips, and his face was growing paler by the second, but his aim never wavered. "Because he's not worth it. Because we're better than this." Samuel's jaw clenched. For a long moment, Margaret thought he might pull the trigger anyway. Then he lowered the rifle slightly, though he kept it pointed in Edwin's general direction. "Get your men and get off my land," he said. "If I ever see you within 5 miles of this cabin again, I will shoot you on sight. That's a promise." Edwin scrambled to help Briggs to his feet. The scarred man was dazed, blood still flowing from the wound on his head. The other 2 men were already mounted, eager to be gone. "This isn't over," Edwin said, but his voice lacked conviction now. He looked at Margaret, and whatever he saw on her face made him flinch. "You could have had a good life with me." "No," Margaret said simply. "I couldn't have, because you don't know the first thing about making a life with someone. You only know how to own things." Edwin turned away and helped Briggs onto his horse. Within minutes, all 4 riders were disappearing into the trees, leaving only blood on the ground and the acrid smell of gunpowder in the air. The moment they were out of sight, Samuel's knees buckled. Margaret caught him before he fell, her arms around his waist, taking his weight. "Easy, I've got you." "I'm fine," he muttered, but his voice was weak. "You're shot, you stubborn fool. Come on, inside. We need to stop that bleeding." She half carried, half dragged him into the cabin and maneuvered him into the chair by the table. His shirt was soaked with blood now, and when she carefully pulled the fabric away from the wound, she saw a neat hole just below his collarbone, blood pulsing out with each heartbeat. "The bullet went through," she said, forcing her voice to stay calm even as her hands shook. "That's good. Nothing's lodged inside." "How do you know about bullet wounds?" "My husband was a hunter. I patched him up more than once when he was careless." She grabbed clean rags from the shelf and pressed them hard against the wound. Samuel hissed in pain. "I need to pack this and bind it tight. It's going to hurt." "Just do it." Margaret worked quickly, her years of nursing her husband and later her daughter's children coming back to her. She cleaned the wound as best she could with whiskey from the bottle Samuel kept for emergencies, then packed it with clean cloth and bound his shoulder tightly. Samuel endured it in silence, his jaw clenched, sweat beading on his forehead. When she was done, he was shaking from shock and blood loss, his lips pale. Margaret covered him with a blanket and made him drink water. "You need a doctor," she said. No doctor. Town's too far, and I don't trust anyone there not to talk. Samuel? If word gets out that Moore shot me, there'll be questions, an investigation, maybe charges filed. That means law enforcement, maybe a trial. He met her eyes. Moore has money and influence. I'm just a homesteader living alone with a woman who's not my wife. How do you think that plays out? Margaret felt sick because she knew he was right. In the eyes of the law and society, they would be the ones judged questionable, not Edwin Moore. Then we take care of it ourselves, she said firmly. But if that wound festers, if you develop fever, then we'll deal with it. Together. His good hand found hers and squeezed weakly. Thank you. For not hiding inside like I told you to. For standing with me. Did you really think I wouldn't? I hoped you wouldn't have to, but I'm grateful you did. He closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him. That thing you did with the skillet, where'd you learn to swing like that? Despite everything, Margaret felt a smile tug at her lips. I had 3 brothers growing up. They taught me to defend myself. Remind me never to make you angry. She sat with him as afternoon faded to evening, checking his bandages, making him drink water, watching for signs of fever. The wound bled slowly but steadily, soaking through the packing twice before it finally began to slow. By nightfall, Samuel was feverish despite her care. His skin burned under her touch, and he muttered in his sleep, fragments of conversation with people who weren't there, names Margaret didn't know, words in a language of dreams and delirium. She bathed his face with cool water and changed the bandages again. The wound looked angry and red at the edges, but there was no sign of the dark streaking that would indicate serious infection. Not yet, anyway. Sometime after midnight, Samuel's eyes opened, clearer than they'd been in hours. Margaret? I'm here. She moved closer, touching his uninjured shoulder gently. If this goes bad, if the fever doesn't break, you need to leave. Take the wagon, go back to town. There's money hidden in a tin under the floorboard by the bed. Take it, start over somewhere else. Stop talking like that. I'm serious. If I die out here, you'll be alone with a body and a story no one will believe. They'll say you killed me. You have to save yourself. You're not going to die. Margaret's voice was fierce. I didn't come all this way. Survive all that humiliation. Find something worth fighting for, just to lose it now. You're going to live, Samuel Carter, because I won't allow otherwise. His lips twitched in something almost like a smile. Is that an order? Yes. Well then. He closed his eyes again. I suppose I'd better obey. The night stretched on, endless and terrifying. Margaret dozed in the chair beside him, jerking awake every time he moved or made a sound. She changed his bandages twice more, forcing water between his lips whenever he was conscious enough to swallow. Toward dawn, she must have fallen into deeper sleep because she woke with a start to find sunlight streaming through the window and Samuel watching her with clear, fever-free eyes. The fever broke, he said, his voice rough but steady. Margaret sat up so quickly her neck cracked. She pressed her hand to his forehead, still warm, but no longer burning. Relief flooded through her so intensely it made her dizzy. Thank heaven, she whispered, or thank the stubborn woman who wouldn't let me die. He tried to sit up and winced. How bad is it? Bad enough. You lost a lot of blood, but the wound is clean, and if we keep it that way, you should heal. She helped him settle back against the pillows she'd piled behind him. You're not to move for at least 3 days. I'll handle everything else. Margaret, I can't just lie here. Yes, you can, and you will. She stood, tucking the blanket more firmly around him. I've handled worse than a few days of extra work. Rest, heal. That's your job now. Over the next few days, Margaret proved her words true. She tended the animals, hauled water, cooked meals, checked Samuel's wound twice daily, and kept the cabin running as if nothing had happened. Samuel chafed at the inactivity, but his weakness kept him mostly compliant. On the 3rd evening, as she was changing his bandage again, he caught her hand. I meant what I said, before Moore showed up, about you mattering, about not being able to afford to lose you. Margaret's heart stumbled. She kept her eyes on the bandage she was wrapping. You were speaking in the heat of the moment. No. I was speaking truth I'd been avoiding for weeks. He waited until she looked at him. I know this is complicated. I know we started as employer and employee. I know the town would have opinions about a man and woman living together out here. But Margaret, I don't. She pulled her hand free gently. Don't say something you might regret when you're thinking more clearly. The only thing I regret is not saying it sooner. His voice was steady, his eyes clear. When that gun went off and I thought I might die right there, my only thought was that I'd never told you how much these weeks have meant. How much you've meant. Margaret sat back, her hands trembling slightly. Samuel, I'm 52 years old. I came here expecting nothing, wanting nothing except work and wages. I don't know how to... You don't have to know anything right now. I'm not asking for promises or plans. He reached for her hand again, and this time she let him take it. I'm just saying that what we have here, whatever this is, it matters to me. You matter to me. And when I'm healed, when things settle down, I'd like to talk about what that means, if you're willing. The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability in his eyes, it undid something in Margaret's chest that had been locked tight for years. She thought about Edwin Moore's cruel rejection, about feeling worthless and used up. She thought about this woman who'd stepped off that train, desperate and humiliated. That woman wouldn't have believed this moment was possible. I'm willing, she said softly. Samuel's hand tightened on hers, and they sat in the lamplight together, the bandaging forgotten, just two broken people who'd somehow found a way to make each other whole. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Margaret was outside hanging laundry when she heard a horse approaching. Her heart jumped, fear flooding back, Moore returning with more men, but when the rider emerged from the trees, it was Alice Warren from the general store. The young woman dismounted quickly and rushed to Margaret. Is it true? Did Edwin Moore really come out here with hired guns? How did you hear about that? The men he brought, one of them came through town with his head bandaged, talking about how some crazy woman nearly killed him with a frying pan. Alice's eyes were wide. Is Samuel all right? I brought medicine and bandages in case. He was shot, but he's healing. Margaret led Alice toward the cabin. Come inside, and thank you for coming all this way. Inside, Samuel was sitting up in bed, looking much stronger than he had days before. He nodded to Alice with something like embarrassment. Miss Warren, you didn't need to make the trip. Yes, I did. Alice set down her basket and began unpacking supplies. Real medical bandages, salve, a bottle of laudanum. When I heard what happened, I knew you two would be out here alone trying to manage. She looked between them. Does anyone else know he shot you? No, Samuel said. And we'd like to keep it that way. Smart. Alice helped Margaret examine the wound, nodding approval at the care that had been taken. This is healing well. You did good work, Margaret. I had practice. Alice rebandaged the shoulder with professional efficiency, then stood back. Edwin Moore left town yesterday. Took a train east. Word is he's not coming back. Margaret and Samuel exchanged glances. Are you certain? Margaret asked. That's what his foreman said. Apparently Moore told him to sell the ranch and send the proceeds. He's done with redemption. Alice smiled. Seems he found frontier life didn't suit him after all. Relief washed through Margaret so powerfully her knees weakened. It was over. The threat was gone. There's something else, Alice said, her voice gentler now. People in town are talking about you two. The story going around is that Margaret is Samuel's cousin from back east, come to help him run his homestead. I thought you should know in case you want to confirm that version. Margaret understood immediately. Alice was offering them a respectable fiction, a way to explain their living arrangement that wouldn't invite scandal. That's very kind, Samuel said. But Margaret isn't my cousin. Alice's eyebrows rose. Then what? I haven't decided yet, Margaret said firmly. But whatever I am, whatever we are, it won't be built on lies. She met Alice's eyes. Thank you for trying to protect us, but I'm done pretending to be something I'm not to make other people comfortable. Alice studied her for a long moment, then smiled. Good for you. She gathered her empty basket. I should get back before dark, but if you need anything, either of you, send word. After Alice left, Samuel looked at Margaret with something like wonder. You keep surprising me. How so? Most women would jump at the chance for a respectable story, but you'd rather face scandal than lie. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to jar his injury. I've spent too much of my life worrying about what people think, being proper, being acceptable, being the right age or the right level of grateful. She touched his face gently. I'm tired, Samuel, tired of being small. If we're going to build something here, let's build it on truth. He caught her hand and pressed it to his cheek. Then here's the truth. I love you, Margaret Hale. I don't care if that's too soon or too complicated or too anything. It's the truth. Margaret's breath caught. No one had said those words to her in so long, not since Thomas died. And even then, it had been the comfortable love of long marriage worn smooth by years. This was different, sharp and new and terrifying. I love you too, she whispered, and felt something break open inside her chest, something that had been sealed shut since the day she'd buried her husband and accepted that her life was essentially over. It wasn't over, it was beginning again. Samuel pulled her down gently, and she curled carefully against his uninjured side, her head on his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart. They lay together as afternoon light moved across the floor and birds sang outside the window. Two people who'd been told they were finished, who'd believed their chances were gone, who'd settled for merely surviving. Finding each other against all odds, finding love in the last place either of them had expected, and discovering that sometimes the best things in life don't come when you're young and full of hope. Sometimes they come when you're battered and worn and convinced you have nothing left to offer. Sometimes they come precisely when you've stopped looking. Sometimes they come exactly when you need them most. The weeks that followed Samuel's recovery were the most peaceful Margaret could remember in years. They fell into a rhythm that felt less like work and more like partnership. True partnership, the kind she'd imagined when she'd first answered Edwin Moore's letter but had never actually experienced. Samuel's shoulder healed slowly, but cleanly, the wound knitting together under Margaret's careful tending. As his strength returned, so did something else, a lightness she suspected had been missing from him long before his wife and son died. She caught him smiling at small things, the way sunlight fell through the kitchen window, the taste of bread fresh from the fire, the sound of her humming while she worked. And Margaret found herself changing too. The tightness she'd carried in her chest since Thomas died, that constant awareness of being a burden, of taking up space she hadn't earned, began to ease. Here, in this rough cabin miles from anywhere, she wasn't too old or too worn or too anything. She was simply herself, and that was enough. They talked more now. Long conversations over supper that stretched into the evening, covering everything from the practical matters of running the homestead to deeper things, memories of their lost spouses, dreams they'd abandoned, fears they'd never spoken aloud. Samuel told her about building this cabin with his own hands, about Sarah's garden that had once flourished where weeds now grew, about Thomas's fascination with the stars. Margaret shared her own stories, raising Catherine alone after Thomas died, the slow realization that her daughter's new family had no real room for her, the desperate loneliness that had driven her to answer a stranger's advertisement. I thought I was too old for new beginnings, she said one evening as they sat outside watching the sun set over the prairie. I thought my life was essentially over except for the waiting. Samuel's hand found hers on the porch step. I thought the same. Figured I'd work this land until it killed me, and that would be that. A fitting end for someone who couldn't save the people who mattered most. You couldn't have saved them from fever any more than I could have saved Thomas from his heart giving out. Margaret squeezed his hand. We're not responsible for death, Samuel, only for how we live after. Took me 5 years to understand that. Took you showing up to make me believe it. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of grass and water and the promise of autumn. Margaret leaned her head against Samuel's good shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear overhead. It was in one of these quiet moments, nearly 6 weeks after the confrontation with Edwin Moore, that Samuel spoke the words that changed everything. Marry me. Margaret's heart stuttered. She sat up, turning to look at him in the fading light. What? Marry me, he repeated, his voice steady. Not because it's expected or because the town needs us to be respectable, but because I love you and I want to build a real life with you. Because I want to wake up every morning knowing you're here by choice, not just necessity. Because when I think about the future now, you're in every part of it. Margaret's throat tightened. Samuel, we barely know each other. It's only been... 2 months. I know. He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious in the twilight. But I knew Sarah for 2 years before we married, and I'm not sure I ever understood her as well as I understand you after 8 weeks. Time doesn't measure what matters, Margaret. What matters is whether we're better together than apart. And I know I'm better with you. People will talk. A woman my age marrying a man she's been living with, let them talk. Do you love me? The question was simple and devastating. Margaret thought about deflecting, about listing all the practical reasons why this was complicated. Then she remembered what she'd told Alice. She was done pretending to be something she wasn't to make others comfortable. Yes, she said. I love you. Then marry me. Not for respectability or convenience. Marry me because you want to. Margaret looked at this man who'd offered her shelter when she had nowhere to go, who'd stood beside her when danger came, who'd seen her at her most desperate and never once made her feel small. She thought about the life they could build together. Not perfect, not easy, but real and honest and theirs. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Samuel's face broke into a smile that transformed him, erasing years of grief and making him look almost young. He pulled her close, carefully, mindful of his still healing shoulder, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with tears. They decided to marry in town, properly, with witnesses and a legal certificate. Not because they cared what redemption thought, but because Margaret wanted it done right this time. No secrets, no shame, no hiding. The next Tuesday, when Samuel made his monthly supply run, Margaret went with him. She wore her best dress, the one she'd saved for her wedding to Edwin Moore, and she'd pinned her hair with extra care. As the wagon rolled toward town, her stomach churned with nerves. What if people are cruel, she asked. What if they say terrible things? Samuel glanced at her, his expression calm. Then we ignore them and get married anyway. Their opinions don't change what we are to each other. Easy to say, harder to live through. You've already lived through worse. You survived Edwin Moore's public rejection. You survived being shot at by hired guns. I think you can survive some gossip. He was right, but that didn't make her less nervous. As they entered Redemption's main street, Margaret felt eyes turn toward them. Conversation stopped. The same pattern as before. The stares, the whispers. But this time, Samuel reached over and took her hand openly, his grip warm and steady. They stopped first at the general store. Alice looked up from behind the counter, and her face lit with genuine pleasure. Margaret, Samuel, I wasn't expecting to see you both today. We came to town on business, Samuel said. We're getting married. Thought you might want to witness. Alice's squeal of delight was so loud it startled the other customers. She rushed around the counter and hugged Margaret tightly. Oh, I'm so happy for you both. When? Today, if the minister's available, Margaret said. He will be. And if he's not, I'll make him available. Alice was already untying her apron. Mister? Peterson, I'm taking my lunch break. The store owner, a thin man with wire spectacles, peered at them with interest. Heard you two were living out past the boundary. People have been talking. People always talk, Samuel said evenly. Doesn't make it any of their business. Peterson sniffed. Suppose not. Congratulations, then. It was hardly enthusiastic, but it wasn't hostile either. Margaret took it as a small victory. They walked to the church, a modest white building at the end of the main street. Reverend Phillips was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a practical manner. When Samuel explained what they wanted, he studied them both carefully. You've been living together out at the Carter place. Yes, Samuel said without hesitation. Margaret worked for me as housekeeper. Now we want to marry. And you're certain about this? You've only known each other a short time. Long enough to know what matters, Margaret said firmly. We're both old enough to know our own minds, Reverend. We're not children rushing into something foolish. The Reverend's lips twitched. No, I don't suppose you are. He glanced at Alice, who nodded encouragingly. Very well. Let me get my book. The ceremony was brief and simple. Alice stood as witness along with the church sexton, an elderly man who'd been sweeping the floor. Reverend Phillips spoke the traditional words, his voice carrying through the small sanctuary. When he asked if they took each other as husband and wife, both Margaret and Samuel answered clearly, their voices steady. Then, by the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Carter." Samuel turned to Margaret, and the look in his eyes made her forget about the sparse surroundings, the meager witness, the unconventional path that had brought them here. He kissed her gently, a promise and a beginning, and when they parted, she saw tears in his eyes that matched her own. They signed the certificate, and it was done. Margaret Carter, she had a new name, a new life, a new chance. Outside the church, Alice hugged them both again. "You have to let me throw you a celebration, a dance at the community hall this Saturday, please? Everyone should know about this." Margaret hesitated, but Samuel surprised her by nodding. "A dance sounds good. We've got nothing to hide." As they walked back toward the wagon, Margaret noticed more people watching. Some faces were disapproving, but others showed curiosity or even cautious approval. Josephine McAllister stood outside her boarding house, and when she caught Margaret's eye, she nodded slowly, a gesture of respect from one survivor to another. They were loading supplies into the wagon when a familiar figure appeared. Margaret's heart sank. Edwin Moore stood 20 feet away, looking haggard and rumpled in a way she'd never seen him before. Alice had said he'd left town, but clearly that information had been wrong. Samuel moved to stand slightly in front of Margaret, his body tense. "Moore, thought you'd gone east." "I got as far as Denver. Couldn't stop thinking about—" Edwin's eyes fixed on Margaret. "I heard you two were in town, heard rumors you were getting married. Please tell me it's not true." "It's true," Margaret said, stepping out from behind Samuel. "We were married 20 minutes ago." Edwin's face crumpled. He looked genuinely distraught, all his earlier arrogance gone. "Margaret, please. I made a terrible mistake. I was cruel and foolish and blind, but I've had time to think, to realize what I lost. Give me another chance. I'll be better. I swear I'll—" "No." The word came out firm and final. "You don't understand. I love you. I realized it too late, but I do. I love you, and I want to make this right." "You don't love me, Edwin. You love the idea of winning. You love not having to admit you made a mistake." Margaret's voice was calm, almost pitying. "If you truly loved me, you would have seen my value on that train platform instead of calling me too old in front of strangers. You would have appreciated what I offered instead of measuring me against some impossible standard." "I was wrong about that. You're not too old. You're perfect. Please, Margaret." "I'm not perfect. I'm just a woman who knows her worth now." She moved closer to Samuel and he put his arm around her waist. "I've made my choice, Edwin. I chose a man who saw me when I was desperate and broken and offered kindness instead of judgment. I chose someone who stands with me instead of over me. I'm sorry you traveled all this way, but my answer is no. It will always be no." Edwin's face darkened, the desperation curdling into something uglier. "You'll regret this. Carter's a nobody with a failing homestead and a dead family. I could have given you comfort, status, a real life. Instead, you're choosing poverty and isolation with a man who's half dead inside." Samuel tensed, but Margaret spoke before he could. "That man you're describing? He doesn't exist anymore. Samuel's very much alive. And so am I, for the first time in years. You can't understand that because you've never bothered to see people as they actually are. You only see what they can do for you." "I see you've made your choice then." Edwin's voice turned cold. "Both of you will learn what that choice costs. This territory's hard on people like you, dreamers who think love conquers all. When winter comes and you're starving, when Carter's shoulder gives him trouble and he can't work, when you're old and sick and have nothing, don't come crying to me." "We won't," Samuel said quietly. "Because we'll have each other. That's worth more than anything you're offering." Edwin stared at them for a long moment, then spat in the dust at their feet. "Fools, both of you!" He turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid with fury and wounded pride. Margaret watched him go and felt nothing but relief. That chapter was closed. Whatever happened now, it would be her choice, her life. Alice had been standing nearby, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. Now she rushed over. "Are you both all right?" "We're fine," Margaret said, and meant it. They finished loading the wagon and prepared to leave. As Samuel helped Margaret up onto the seat, a commotion erupted near the saloon. Raised voices, the sound of glass breaking. Margaret turned to see Edwin Moore stumbling out of the building, clearly drunk despite the early hour, shouting incoherently. "Someone should help him," Alice said quietly. "Someone will," Margaret replied, "but it won't be us." They rode out of town as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie. Margaret didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing, only forward, toward the cabin that was now truly her home. They were halfway back when Samuel spoke. "He's not wrong about everything. This life is hard. Winter here can kill if you're not prepared. And my shoulder might never be at full strength again. I know. There will be lean times, times when we struggle, times when it would be easier to quit. I know that too." Margaret looked at him steadily. "I'm not naive, Samuel. I know what I'm choosing. I grew up on a farm. I've lived through hard times before. I'm not afraid of work or sacrifice or difficulty." "What are you afraid of?" The question made her pause. She considered it honestly. "I'm afraid of becoming invisible again, of being just an obligation or a burden, of losing myself in someone else's expectations." Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her fully. "Then hear me clearly, Margaret Carter. You are not invisible to me. You never will be. You're not an obligation or a burden. You're my partner, my equal, my choice. And I will spend every day of our life together making sure you know that." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being truly seen, truly valued, truly chosen. Samuel pulled her close, and they held each other in the middle of the empty prairie while the horses stamped and the wind sang through the grass. When they finally arrived at the cabin, the sun was setting in brilliant streaks of orange and gold. Samuel carried Margaret over the threshold, carefully, mindful of his shoulder, and they both laughed at the traditional gesture made awkward by circumstance. Inside, the cabin glowed in the last light of day. It looked different to Margaret now, not just a shelter or a workplace, but a home. Their home. She moved through the familiar space with new eyes, seeing it as it would be. Curtains in the windows, rugs on the floor, shelves filled with books and small treasures. A life built piece by piece through their shared effort. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked, watching her from the doorway. "I'm thinking about all the ways I could make this place beautiful. All the things we could build together." She turned to face him. "I'm thinking about the future, and for the first time in years, it doesn't frighten me." Samuel crossed the room and took her hands. "Build whatever you want. Dream as big as you can. We'll make it happen together." That night, they shared the cabin as husband and wife for the first time. There was tenderness in their coming together, a gentle exploration of two people who'd thought their chances for this kind of intimacy were long past. Margaret felt self-conscious about her aging body, the lines and softness that came with 52 years, but Samuel touched her with such reverence that her insecurities melted away. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the prairie night, Margaret felt a completeness she'd never experienced before. With Thomas, it had been good, comfortable, and familiar. But this was different. This was two fully formed people choosing each other with clear eyes and open hearts. "I used to think love only happened once," she whispered, "that Thomas was my only chance. What do you think now?" "I think love comes when we're ready for it. Not when we're young and naive, but when we've been broken enough to appreciate being made whole." Samuel kissed the top of her head. "Then I'm grateful for every hard thing that brought us to this moment." The days following their marriage had a dreamlike quality. They worked together on the homestead, making improvements they'd discussed but not acted on before. Samuel built a proper chicken coop with Margaret's help, and she planted herbs near the cabin door. They talked about expanding the garden come spring, maybe adding a milk cow, building a proper porch where they could sit on summer evenings. But their peace was shattered 3 days before the scheduled dance when Alice arrived at the cabin unannounced, her face pale with worry. "Edwin's been drinking heavily," she said without preamble. "He's telling anyone who'll listen that you two humiliated him, that he's going to make you pay. Samuel, people are taking him seriously. Some men have started talking about riding out here, about teaching you a lesson for stealing his bride." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Let them come. This is my land, legally filed and paid for. I have every right to defend it. It's not about rights. It's about mob mentality and wounded pride. Alice looked at Margaret. You should both come stay in town until this blows over. You could stay with Josephine. No. Margaret's voice was firm. We run now. We'll always be running. We stay, and we face whatever comes. Margaret, these men are dangerous when they're riled up. So am I. Margaret met Alice's worried gaze. I've been underestimated my whole life, Alice. By my daughter, by Edwin Moore, by everyone who looked at my gray hair and decided I was finished. I'm done running from other people's anger. Alice looked between them, saw the resolution in both their faces, and sighed. Then at least be prepared. I'll send word if I hear anything specific. After she left, Samuel checked his rifle and pistol, making sure both were loaded and ready. Margaret watched him, her stomach tight with anxiety, but her resolve unshaken. We could leave, Samuel said quietly. Start over somewhere else, somewhere no one knows us. And spend our whole lives looking over our shoulders? No. Margaret moved to stand beside him. This is our home. We defend it. That night, they lay awake in the darkness, both alert for sounds of approaching riders. But the hours passed quietly, and eventually exhaustion claimed them. The next morning brought not violence, but an unexpected visitor. The sheriff from Redemption, a grizzled man named Tom Bradley, who Margaret had never actually met, rode into their clearing alone. Samuel stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand but not raised. Sheriff? Carter. Bradley dismounted slowly, hands visible. I came to talk, not cause trouble. May I? Samuel nodded, and the sheriff climbed the porch steps. Margaret joined them, wiping flour from her hands. Mrs. Carter, Bradley said with a nod of respect, congratulations on your marriage. Thank you. What brings you out here, Sheriff? Edwin Moore. Bradley removed his hat and turned it in his hands. He's been stirring up trouble in town, making threats. I wanted to warn you and see if you wanted to file a complaint. Against him for what? Talking? Samuel's voice was cautious. For assault. Alice Warren told me about what happened out here weeks ago. The shooting, the hired guns. That's serious business, Carter. Attempted murder, potentially. Margaret and Samuel exchanged glances. Pursuing charges would mean investigations, testimonies, possibly a trial. It would put their unconventional living arrangement under scrutiny, but it might also end the threat once and for all. Why are you offering this now? Samuel asked. Bradley sighed. Because Moore's getting dangerous. Last night he pulled a gun in the saloon, threatened to shoot any man who defended you. I can't arrest him for threats alone, but if you file charges for what happened before, I can lock him up legally. You believe our story? Margaret asked. Even though we're just two people living alone out here with no witnesses to back us up? Alice Warren witnessed the aftermath. She saw Carter's wound, and I've known Edwin Moore long enough to know he's got a mean streak. Bradley met her eyes. I believe you, Mrs. Carter. More importantly, I believe everyone deserves to feel safe in their own home. Samuel lowered the rifle completely. If we file charges, will it stick? Or will Moore's money get him out of it? Can't promise anything. But I'll do my job right, and that means making sure the law protects people, not just property. Margaret thought about Edwin's face when she'd rejected him, the cold fury in his eyes. She thought about the threat he represented, not just to them, but to anyone who didn't fit his vision of how the world should work. File the charges, she said firmly. All of them. Bradley nodded and pulled out a notebook. They spent the next hour recounting everything. The initial rejection, Edwin's return with hired guns, the shooting, the threats. The sheriff wrote it all down carefully, asking questions, ensuring he had the details right. When he was done, he put away his notebook and stood. I'll arrest him today. There'll be a hearing, probably in 2 weeks. You'll both need to testify. We'll be there, Samuel said. After Bradley left, Margaret felt oddly lighter. They'd taken action instead of simply waiting for trouble to find them. Whatever happened now, they'd stood up and said this wasn't acceptable. The dance that Saturday came faster than expected. Margaret had almost forgotten about it in the tension of recent days, but Alice appeared Friday afternoon with a dress she'd altered to fit Margaret. You're going to walk into that hall with your head high, Alice insisted. You're going to show everyone that you're not ashamed or afraid. You're going to dance with your husband and celebrate your marriage properly. The dress was beautiful, deep blue with simple lines that flattered Margaret's figure. She tried it on in the cabin while Alice watched critically, pinning and adjusting until it fit perfectly. "You look lovely," Alice said softly. "Truly." Margaret studied herself in the small mirror Samuel had hung on the wall. She saw a woman who'd been tested and survived, who'd found love when she'd stopped looking for it, who'd learned finally to value herself. The gray in her hair no longer looked like defeat. It looked like wisdom earned. Saturday evening, they rode into town in the wagon, Margaret wearing the blue dress and her mother's cameo. Samuel had put on his best shirt, and though his shoulder was still stiff, he held himself straight and proud. The community hall blazed with light and music. When they walked in, conversations faltered. Margaret felt every eye in the room turn toward them. The woman who'd been rejected, the hermit widower, now married and openly claiming their place. Then Josephine McAllister crossed the room and embraced Margaret warmly. "Welcome, Mrs. Carter. About time you two made it official." Her acceptance broke the ice. Other women approached, some cautiously, some warmly, offering congratulations. The men nodded to Samuel, and a few even clapped him on the back. Not everyone was friendly, but enough were that Margaret felt the tight knot in her chest begin to ease. When the music started, Samuel led her onto the dance floor. His movements were careful because of his shoulder, and Margaret was self-conscious about her age and her rusty dancing skills. But as they moved together, everything else faded away. There was only the music, the warmth of his hand in hers, the look in his eyes that said she was the only person in the room who mattered. They danced 3 dances before Samuel's shoulder forced them to stop. They stood on the sidelines, watching others whirl past, Samuel's arm around Margaret's waist. "Happy?" he asked. "Very. No regrets?" Margaret thought about the woman who'd stepped off the train in humiliation, about Edwin Moore's cruel rejection, about all the twisting paths that had brought her to this moment. Not one. The evening wore on, and Margaret found herself actually enjoying the social interaction. Women asked about the homestead, about her plans for the garden, about how she'd learned to make bread over a wood fire. Men discussed cattle and weather with Samuel, including him in their conversations in a way they never had before. Then the hall door opened and Edwin Moore walked in. He was drunk, visibly swaying, his clothes disheveled and his eyes wild. The music stopped. Conversations died. Everyone turned to stare as he stood in the doorway, his gaze finding Margaret and fixing on her with terrible intensity. "There she is," he slurred, "the woman who destroyed my life." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the refreshment table. "Moore, you're drunk. Time to go home." "Not until she hears what I have to say." Edwin lurched forward, and people moved out of his path. "I loved you, Margaret. I came back for you. I was willing to overlook your age, your worn-out body, everything, and you threw it back in my face for a broken-down widower with a bullet hole in him." Samuel moved to step between them, but Margaret touched his arm, stopping him. This was her fight. "You didn't love me, Edwin," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the silent hall. "You loved the idea of winning. You loved not having to admit you made a mistake. But you never loved me because you never actually saw me. I saw you perfectly. An old woman desperate enough to travel hundreds of miles for a stranger. A woman nobody else wanted. You're right. I was desperate. I was lonely and afraid and willing to settle for someone who'd made it clear I was a last resort." Margaret stepped forward, her voice steady. "But I'm not that woman anymore. I found someone who values me, someone who sees me as a partner, not a servant or a possession. You had your chance, Edwin. You threw it away when you chose cruelty over kindness. You'll regret this." Spittle flew from his lips. "Both of you will. Edwin Moore. You're under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon and attempted murder." Sheriff Bradley's voice cut through the ranting. "I'm taking you in right now. You can't arrest me. I'm a landowner, a respected—" "You're a man who shot an unarmed person on his own property with witnesses. Come quietly, or I'll add resisting arrest to the charges." 2 deputies Margaret hadn't noticed before stepped forward and took Edwin's arms. He struggled briefly, still shouting threats and obscenities, but they dragged him toward the door. As they passed Margaret, Edwin spat directly at her feet. Samuel tensed, but the deputies were already pulling Edwin out into the night. The door closed behind them, cutting off his curses. The hall was silent. Then Alice began to clap. Josephine joined her, and slowly others did too, not everyone, but enough. A recognition that Margaret had stood her ground, that she'd spoken truth to someone who'd tried to diminish her, that she'd refused to be cowed by his rage or his threats. Reverend Philip stepped forward and gestured to the musicians. I believe we were having a celebration. No reason to let one man's bitterness ruin it. Play on. The music resumed, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. People returned to dancing, to talking, to the business of community. Margaret felt Samuel's hand find hers and squeeze gently. You were magnificent, he murmured. I was honest. That's all. That's everything. They stayed until the end of the dance, accepting congratulations and good wishes from people who'd dismissed Margaret as irrelevant just weeks before. When they finally climbed into the wagon for the ride home, the stars were brilliant overhead, and the air was cool with the promise of autumn. Things will be different now, Samuel said as they rolled through the darkness. People saw us tonight, really saw us. We're not just the hermit and the rejected bride anymore. No, Margaret agreed. We're just ourselves, and that's enough. The cabin welcomed them back with its familiar warmth. They prepared for bed in comfortable silence, and as Margaret brushed out her hair, she caught Samuel watching her in the mirror. What? She asked. Just thinking how lucky I am, how close I came to missing this. We both did. What? She set down the brush and turned to face him. But we didn't. We found each other, and whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Samuel pulled her close, and they stood in the lamplight of their cabin. Two people who'd been told their best years were behind them, who'd believed they were finished with hope and possibility, who'd discovered that sometimes the most important chapters of life come not at the beginning, but in the middle of the story when you've learned enough to appreciate what you're being given. Outside, the prairie wind sang its endless song, and somewhere in the darkness, the future waited, uncertain, challenging, full of both hardship and joy. But Margaret Carter wasn't afraid anymore. She had love, she had purpose, and she had finally, completely, found herself. That was worth every hard mile that had brought her here. The week following Edwin's arrest passed with an odd mixture of calm and tension. Margaret and Samuel returned to their routines, tending the animals, working the land, sharing meals and conversation, but always with an awareness that the final confrontation was still to come. The hearing loomed ahead, a reckoning that would determine not just Edwin's fate, but in some ways their own standing in the community. Sheriff Bradley visited twice more, once to take additional statements, and once to warn them that Edwin had hired a lawyer from Denver, a slick-talking man known for getting wealthy clients out of trouble. Don't let it worry you, Bradley said, though his expression suggested he was worried enough for all of them. Truth is truth, and we've got it on our side. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and bright, autumn asserting itself with frost on the grass and a sharp wind that cut through even heavy clothing. Margaret dressed in her blue dress again, the one she'd worn to the dance, and pinned her mother's cameo at her throat like armor. Samuel wore his good shirt despite the difficulty of getting it over his still healing shoulder. He moved stiffly, and Margaret noticed him wince when he thought she wasn't looking. We could ask for a postponement, she said as they prepared to leave. Give your shoulder more time. No, I want this finished. He checked the rifle one last time before leaving it behind. They wouldn't be allowed weapons in the courthouse anyway. Whatever happens today, we face it and move forward. The ride into town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Margaret watched the familiar landscape roll past and thought about how much had changed since that first humiliating day on the train platform. She'd been a different person then, smaller, more afraid, willing to accept crumbs because she believed that was all she deserved. Now she knew better. Redemption's courthouse was the largest building in town, a two-story structure that also served as the mayor's office and the land registry. A crowd had gathered outside, more people than Margaret would have expected for a simple hearing. She recognized faces from the dance, from the general store, from her few trips to town. Some looked curious, some sympathetic, some openly hostile. Alice pushed through the crowd and grabbed Margaret's hand. I'm so glad you're here. Half the town is talking about this. Some people are saying Edwin's the victim, that you two conspired to trap him. Let them say what they want, Margaret replied, though her stomach churned. We know the truth. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Judge Harrison presided, a stern-faced man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness but no tolerance for foolishness. Edwin sat at the front with his lawyer, a sharp-dressed man who looked supremely confident. Edwin himself had cleaned up since the dance, but Margaret could see the tremor in his hands, the sallow cast to his skin that spoke of too much drinking and too little sleep. Sheriff Bradley gestured for Margaret and Samuel to sit in the front row on the opposite side. As they took their seats, Edwin's eyes found Margaret, and the hatred in them was so pure it made her breath catch. This wasn't about love or loss anymore, if it ever had been. This was about a man whose ego couldn't survive being rejected, whose sense of entitlement had curdled into something poisonous. Judge Harrison called the hearing to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. We're here to determine if there's sufficient cause to charge Edwin Moore with assault with a deadly weapon and attempted murder. Sheriff Bradley, present your case. Bradley stood and laid out the facts methodically. The confrontation at the cabin, the hired guns, the shooting of Samuel Carter, the threats made afterward. He called Alice Warren first to testify about Samuel's wound and Margaret's condition when she'd ridden out to check on them. Alice spoke clearly, describing the blood-soaked bandages and Samuel's weakened state. There's no question he was shot, Your Honor. The wound was fresh and Mrs. Carter had been caring for him for days. Edwin's lawyer, a man named Cartwright, cross-examined her sharply. But you didn't actually witness the shooting, did you, Miss Warren? No, but... So you can't say definitively who fired the weapon or under what circumstances? The circumstances were that Mr. Moore brought armed men to threaten... That's speculation, not evidence. Cartwright smiled coolly. No further questions. Samuel was called next. He walked to the stand with careful dignity, his injured shoulder obvious in the way he held himself. Bradley took him through the events of that day. Edwin's arrival with 3 hired men, the threats, the violence. And then one of them drew a pistol and shot me, Samuel said, his voice steady. Hit me right here. He touched his shoulder. I was unarmed. Margaret and I were standing on our own property, and they attacked us. Cartwright rose for cross-examination, his expression almost bored. Mr. Carter, you've been living alone for 5 years, is that correct? Yes. And then Mrs. Carter now, came to live with you, a woman you barely knew. Wasn't that unusual? She worked for me. I needed help with the homestead. And she slept where exactly? Samuel's jaw tightened. In the cabin. While you slept? In the barn at first, then in the cabin after we married. But before you married, you two were living together, unchaperoned, in an isolated cabin. Cartwright let the implication hang. Some might say that's improper. Some might even say you conspired to steal my client's intended bride. Objection, Bradley said sharply. Mrs. Carter was never Mr. Moore's bride. He rejected her publicly and cruelly. Sustained, Judge Harrison said. Mr. Cartwright, stick to relevant questions. But the damage was done. Margaret could see it in the faces of the spectators, the raised eyebrows, the knowing looks, the whispers. They were being painted as the villains, the schemers, while Edwin was the wronged party. Margaret was called last. She walked to the stand with her head high, refusing to show the fear churning in her stomach. Bradley's questions were straightforward. What happened that day? What threats were made? What she witnessed? She answered clearly, describing Edwin's arrival, the hired guns, the escalating violence. One of the men tried to grab me. I defended myself. Then his associate shot Samuel without provocation or warning. We were on our own land, threatening no one. Then Cartwright stood for his cross-examination, and Margaret steeled herself. Mrs. Carter, you came to redemption as a mail-order bride, correct? Yes. Specifically to marry my client, Edwin Moore. That was the arrangement, yes. An arrangement you broke when you instead took up with Mr. Samuel Carter. Mr. Moore broke the arrangement when he rejected me on the train platform and called me too old to be useful. Cartwright smiled as if she'd proven his point. You must have been very angry about that rejection, very humiliated. I was hurt, yes. Angry enough to want revenge? To To conspire with another man to make my client look foolish? Margaret felt fury rise in her chest, but she kept her voice level. I wanted work and a place to live. Mr. Carter offered both without conditions or expectations. There was no conspiracy, Mr. Cartwright. Just two lonely people who found companionship. Companionship. Cartwright made the word sound sordid. Is that what you call living in sin with a man you just met? We weren't living in sin. We were employer and employee, and then we fell in love and married properly. There's nothing shameful in that. Nothing shameful in stealing another man's intended bride? I was never his bride. He made that abundantly clear. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes locked on Cartwright. Your client rejected me publicly, cruelly, and without kindness. He told me I was too old, too worn, too worthless to be his wife. When I found happiness elsewhere, he couldn't stand it. His pride couldn't survive a woman he'd rejected finding value with someone else. So he came to our home with armed men and violence. That's what happened, Mr. Cartwright. Not some conspiracy. Just a man who couldn't accept that the world doesn't revolve around his wants. The courtroom was utterly silent. Cartwright's smile had frozen on his face. Edwin looked like he wanted to lunge at her. No further questions, Cartwright said tightly. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess to consider the testimony. Margaret and Samuel stepped outside into the cool air, both of them shaking with tension. You were incredible in there, Samuel said quietly. I just told the truth. That's what made it incredible. Alice appeared with water for both of them. Half the town is arguing about this. Some people think Edwin's the victim. Others are saying they always knew he had a cruel streak. 20 minutes later, they were called back inside. Judge Harrison looked severe as he surveyed the packed courtroom. I've heard the testimony and considered the evidence. While there are no witnesses to the actual shooting beyond the involved parties, I find the physical evidence, Mr. Carter's wound, the blood loss, Miss Warren's testimony, credible and compelling. Additionally, Mr. Moore's behavior at the community dance, his public threats, and his documented history of volatile behavior support the assertion that he came to the Carter homestead with violent intent. Edwin's face went white. Cartwright started to rise, but the judge waved him down. Therefore, I am ordering Edwin Moore to stand trial for assault with a deadly weapon. Bail is set at $500. Furthermore, I am issuing a restraining order forbidding Mr. Moore from approaching Mr. or Mrs. Carter or their property. Violation will result in immediate arrest. Harrison's gavel came down hard. This hearing is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in noise. Some people cheered, others protested. Edwin stood frozen, his lawyer speaking urgently in his ear. Margaret felt Samuel's arm around her waist, steadying her, and she leaned into him gratefully. Sheriff Bradley appeared at their side. You two did good. Truth won out. What happens now? Samuel asked. Trial will be in about 6 weeks. Moore will probably make bail, but with the restraining order, he can't come near you. Bradley's expression was grim. That doesn't mean he won't try something. Be careful out there. They pushed through the crowd toward the door. People called out to them, some congratulations, some accusations. Margaret kept her eyes forward and her head high. They'd told their truth. That would have to be enough. Outside, Josephine McAllister waited by their wagon. I heard what happened in there. You stood your ground. Good for you. Thank you for believing us, Margaret said. I know what it's like to be judged unfairly. I know what it's like to have people assume the worst. Josephine's scarred face was fierce. You two built something good. Don't let anyone take that from you. As they climbed into the wagon, Reverend Phillips approached. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Carter, I wanted to say that I believe you both conducted yourselves with honesty and dignity today. The church stands with you. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you, Reverend. The ride home was quiet, both of them processing what had happened. As the cabin came into view through the trees, Margaret felt something in her chest finally unclench. They'd faced the worst and survived. Edwin would stand trial, and whether he was convicted or not, the truth was now public record. That night, they sat together on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Samuel's arm was around Margaret's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth. Do you think he'll be convicted? She asked. I don't know. Rich men have a way of escaping consequences. Samuel's voice was calm, accepting. But it doesn't matter as much as I thought it would. We told our truth. We stood together. That's what matters. I keep thinking about what that lawyer said, about us living in sin, about conspiracy. Margaret's voice was quiet. Part of me wonders if people will always see us that way. Some will. Some people need villains to make sense of the world. Samuel turned her face toward him gently. But the people who matter, Alice, Josephine, Reverend Phillips, Sheriff Bradley, they see us for what we are. Two people who found each other and chose love. That's not a sin, Margaret. That's a miracle. She kissed him then, soft and lingering, and felt the last of her fear dissolve. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The weeks leading up to the trial passed in a strange mixture of peace and anticipation. Samuel's shoulder continued to heal, though it would never have its full strength again. Margaret expanded the garden, planning for spring planting even as autumn deepened. They worked together on winterizing the cabin, chinkling gaps in the logs, reinforcing the roof, laying in supplies. Alice visited regularly, bringing news from town. Edwin had made bail and was living in a hotel, drinking heavily and making increasingly wild accusations. His ranch had been sold, and rumor had it he was running out of money fast. People are starting to turn on him, Alice reported on one visit. The more he drinks and rants, the less credible he seems. Even his supporters are getting tired of it. The trial, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. Cartwright tried every trick he could, but the evidence was damning. Samuel's scar, medical testimony about the wound, statements from the hired guns who'd been tracked down and offered immunity for testimony. One of them, the man called Briggs, admitted that Edwin had specifically ordered them to rough up the Carters and teach them a lesson. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on the assault charge. The attempted murder charge was reduced to reckless endangerment, but it was enough. Edwin Moore was sentenced to 3 years in territorial prison and ordered to pay restitution to Samuel for medical expenses and lost work. Margaret watched Edwin's face as the sentence was read. She expected rage, defiance, threats. Instead, she saw only a broken man, hollow-eyed and diminished, all his arrogance finally stripped away. For a moment, she almost felt pity. Then she remembered his cruelty on that platform, his violence at their cabin, his attempts to destroy what she and Samuel had built. Her pity evaporated. Justice, she thought, didn't always feel satisfying, but it felt right. 3 weeks after the trial, as winter began to settle over the prairie with its first serious snowfall, Margaret received an unexpected letter. The postmark was from back east, from her daughter Catherine. She opened it with trembling hands, not sure what to expect. The letter was short and stilted, clearly difficult for Catherine to write. She acknowledged receiving Margaret's letter about the marriage, expressed surprise but tentative support, and mentioned that perhaps when spring came, she might visit with the children to meet their new step-grandfather. It wasn't warm. It wasn't the enthusiastic embrace Margaret might have hoped for, but it was something, a small bridge being built across the distance that had grown between them. She wants to visit in the spring, Margaret told Samuel that evening, her voice catching. Samuel pulled her close. Then we'll make her welcome. Show her the life you've built. Show her the woman you've become. What if she doesn't approve? What if she thinks I've lost my mind, marrying a stranger and living out here in the middle of nowhere? Then she'll see that you're happy anyway, that you don't need her approval to live your life. He kissed the top of her head. You're not the same woman who left her daughter's house feeling like a burden, Margaret. You're stronger now, free. He was right. She was free. Free from the need to make herself small, free from the belief that her value was tied to her youth or her usefulness to others, free to simply be herself in all her complicated, aging, imperfect glory. Winter deepened, and the cabin became a warm haven against the cold world outside. Margaret and Samuel settled into the rhythms of married life, small routines that built intimacy, quiet evenings by the fire, shared work, and shared dreams. One evening in late December, as snow fell softly outside and firelight flickered across the walls, Margaret found herself thinking about that desperate woman who'd stepped off the train months ago. "What are you smiling about?" Samuel asked from his chair where he was mending a bridle. "I was just thinking about the day I arrived, how certain I was that my life was over." that I'd reached the end of anything that mattered. And now? Now I know that sometimes endings are really beginnings in disguise. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you opens the door to the best thing. She set down her sewing and crossed to sit on the arm of his chair. Edwin Moore rejecting me was the best thing that could have happened. If he'd accepted me, I'd have spent the rest of my life trying to be useful enough to justify my existence. Instead, I found someone who values me for exactly who I am. Samuel set aside the bridle and pulled her down into his lap, careful of his shoulder. You know what I think? I think you would have figured out your worth eventually, with or without me. You're too strong not to. I just got lucky enough to be here when you did. They sat together in the firelight, two people who'd traveled such different paths to reach this same place. Outside, the wind howled and snow piled against the windows, but inside was warmth and safety and the quiet contentment of knowing you're exactly where you belong. Spring came eventually, as it always does. The snow melted, the creek ran high and fast, and the prairie transformed into a sea of green dotted with wildflowers. Margaret's garden flourished under her care, and Samuel's small herd grew by 3 calves. In early May, a telegram arrived announcing Catherine's visit. Margaret spent a week in anxious preparation, cleaning the cabin until it shone, planning meals, worrying about what her daughter would think. When the wagon carrying Catherine, her husband James, and their 2 children finally rolled up to the cabin, Margaret felt her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Catherine stepped down from the wagon, and Margaret saw her daughter's eyes widen as she took in the cabin, the garden, the rough frontier life her mother had chosen. For a moment, Margaret braced herself for judgment, for disappointment. Then Catherine smiled, tentatively but genuinely. "Mother, you look different, happy." "I am happy." Margaret moved forward and embraced her daughter, feeling the stiffness in Catherine's posture gradually ease. "Welcome. Come inside and meet Samuel properly." The visit lasted 3 days. At first, there was awkwardness. Catherine clearly hadn't known what to expect and was struggling to reconcile the proper, subdued mother she remembered with this woman who ran a frontier homestead and spoke her mind without apology. But gradually, Catherine began to relax. She watched Margaret and Samuel work together with easy partnership, saw the way they communicated with glances and small gestures, witnessed the quiet affection between them. She helped in the garden and admitted almost reluctantly that her mother seemed more alive than she'd been in years. On the last evening, after the children were asleep and James had retired early, Catherine and Margaret sat together on the porch while Samuel tended to evening chores in the barn. "I owe you an apology," Catherine said quietly. "After Father died, I thought I was doing the right thing by taking you in. But I made you feel like a burden. Like you were just there because I had to do my duty. You were young and starting your own family, I understand. No, that's not an excuse. I should have seen that you were grieving, that you needed purpose, not just a corner to exist in." Catherine's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "When you left, part of me was relieved, and I've felt guilty about that every day since." Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. "You don't have to feel guilty. We both did what we needed to do. You built your life, and I found mine." "Do you really love him, Samuel?" "More than I thought possible at my age. More than I believed I deserved." Margaret smiled. "He sees me, Catherine. Not as a mother or a duty or a convenience, just as me, and that's worth more than comfort or convenience or anything else." Catherine squeezed her hand. "Then I'm happy for you, Mother. Truly." The next morning, as Catherine's family prepared to leave, the children hugged Margaret enthusiastically and demanded promises that they could visit again. James shook Samuel's hand with genuine respect, and Catherine embraced her mother tightly. "Write to me," she whispered. "Tell me about your life here. I want to know." "I will," Margaret promised. She and Samuel stood together watching the wagon disappear into the distance, carrying her daughter back to her own life while Margaret remained in hers. "Are you all right?" Samuel asked. "Better than all right. For the first time, Catherine and I met as equals, not mother and child, not burden and caretaker, but 2 women who love each other and respect each other's choices." Margaret turned to face him. "That's a gift I never expected." Summer brought the community dance again, an annual tradition. This time, Margaret and Samuel arrived not as scandal, but as an established couple, accepted and even respected by most of the town. They danced together as the sun set, and Margaret caught Josephine's eye across the room. The older woman nodded, a gesture of solidarity between two women who'd fought for their place and won. As autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson again, marking a full year since Margaret's arrival, she stood in her garden harvesting the last of the vegetables and felt a completeness she'd never known before. She was 53 years old. Her hair was entirely gray now, and the lines on her face had deepened from a year of frontier sun and wind. Her hands were rough from work, her body marked by the passage of time, and she had never felt more beautiful, more valuable, more alive. Samuel emerged from the barn and crossed to where she stood, his own body showing the scars of the year, the shoulder that still sometimes ached, the new lines around his eyes. They were both marked by survival, by struggle, by the simple fact of living. "What are you thinking?" he asked, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. "I'm thinking about that woman who stepped off the train a year ago. How lost she was. How certain she was that her life was over. And what would you tell her if you could?" Margaret leaned back against him, watching the sun paint the sky with fire. "I'd tell her to hold on, that the rejection that feels like the end is actually the beginning, that she's about to discover she was never too old for love or hope or second chances, that the best chapter of her life is about to start, and all she has to do is be brave enough to claim it." Would she believe you? Probably not, but she'd find out soon enough. Margaret turned in his arms to face him. "We did it, Samuel. We built something real and good from nothing but determination and hope." "No," he corrected gently. "We built something real and good from seeing each other clearly, from choosing each other every day, from refusing to accept the world's judgment of our worth." As darkness fell and stars began to appear overhead, they walked back to the cabin hand in hand. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth and supper and the simple comfort of home. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges and the endless demands of frontier life. But tonight, there was only this: two people who'd been broken and discarded, who'd found each other in the aftermath of loss and rejection, who'd built a love that didn't depend on youth or beauty or society's approval. A love that was strong precisely because it had been forged in fire. Margaret Carter stood in the doorway of her cabin and looked at the life she'd built, not despite being 53, but because of everything those 53 years had taught her. She'd learned that worthiness doesn't diminish with age, that love doesn't expire, that the most profound transformations often come in the least expected moments. She'd learned that she was enough. And in the end, that was the greatest gift of all, not the cabin or the land or even Samuel's love, precious as it was. The greatest gift was discovering her own value, learning to see herself as worthy not because of what she could do for others, but simply because she existed. "Ready to come inside?" Samuel asked from behind her. "Yes," Margaret said, and stepped over the threshold into warmth and light and home. "I'm ready." The door closed softly behind them, shutting out the darkness and the cold. And if somewhere in the distance, a train whistle called across the prairie, carrying other desperate people toward uncertain futures, Margaret didn't hear it. She was exactly where she belonged, living the life she'd chosen, loved for exactly who she was. Too old? The woman who'd believed that lie was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, freer than she'd ever been at 20 or 30 or 40. In her place stood Margaret Carter, who'd learned that the story of your life isn't over until you decide it is. And sometimes, the best chapters come long after you've stopped expecting them. The fire crackled in the hearth. Supper filled the cabin with good smells. Samuel's hand found hers across the table, and Margaret smiled, knowing that tomorrow and all the tomorrows after would be built on this foundation of truth and choice and hard-won love. The beginning had been painful. The middle had been uncertain. But the ending, this ending that was really just another beginning, was exactly right.